Go ahead and hit that button before I forget. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started then. Welcome out everyone to this month's webinar titled Everything You Need to Know About Naming Rights in 2024. For those of you who are with us for the first time, here at Sponsor CX, we run a monthly webinar series where we bring in a very talented partner of ours within the industry, and we discuss some really cool content and topics within the sponsorship world. So we're very excited to have you guys out today. If you've been with us before, you kind of know how this goes. We like to keep these discussions around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we leave some time at the end to answer questions and interact with the audience. Before I introduce our speakers, I did just want to go over a few housekeeping items. As you guys might have noticed, this is being recorded. And so if you have to drop off, or if you have someone that registered, they'll be getting the link to this recording here shortly after the webinar concludes. If you have questions along the way, feel free to use the Q&A or chat. Sometimes we'll answer questions as we go, but if we don't get to it then, we'll get to it at the end of the webinar. With that being said, I'd like to introduce myself and our speakers. My name is Jesse Fain. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Sponsor CX. Alongside me, I have our CEO, Jason Smith. And then I've got Seth Frankenthal, founder and president of SRS Partners. He's been in the sports and entertainment industry for over 15 years now, and he got his start on the brand consulting side. And then about 3 years ago, he broke out on his own and started SRS Partners, which exists to help clients understand and optimize their sponsorship platforms. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass the time over to Jason and Seth.
Seth, he made you sound more important than you really are.
All right. Isn't that sales 101?
On that note, we're going to naming rights, right? That's awesome. No, so Jesse, thank you for this, and Seth, thanks for joining our webinar today. I'll just say Seth's a good friend, and he has done some amazing work in this space. And if you ever talk to Seth about naming rights, like the guy's like super passionate about it. So you're going to get a really passionate dose of naming rights here from Seth, and we brought him in as the expert here for everybody to learn from. But I think we wanted to start off, Jesse, didn't we, with some poll question for the group here as well?
Yes.
And the first one is, have you ever worked on naming rights before, right? Don't we have kind of a yes or no? Kind of see how many have actually done naming rights deals?
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so I just launched the first, so it's 2 questions.
Actually has both of them. Has both of them. Yeah. So it's like, have you ever worked on naming rights before? Yes or no? What is your biggest challenge when it comes to naming rights? And as you guys are kind of voting, or it says voting there. I don't know if you're voting more than answering there, but as you answer, I'll just say this is a topic that is really interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of naming rights. We're gonna be talking about what types of naming rights are out there, and maybe get your brain thinking a little bit about ways that you can, find some naming right opportunities with your organizations or properties. And then we'll transition into why brands do naming rights or do not do naming rights. And kind of what are the benefits of those, and then we'll transition them and just maybe sharing some impactful examples of naming rights, and then how to actually structure a naming right deal. So we'll try and be as efficient as possible. We don't want this to go too terribly long.
Can you guys see the results, Jason, of the poll questions?
I cannot.
Okay.
Same here.
I can't figure out how to make it so you guys can see them, but I'll read them out to you here. So it looks like 70% of the audience has worked on naming rights before. And the biggest challenge when it comes to naming rights is knowing who to target. Is the big one that came in at 40% of the votes. And then second place was using naming rights effectively. And third place was getting the deal done.
Awesome. Well, good. Well, Seth, do you want to start on that note with these poll questions?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks for everyone who's joining here today. It's great to meet, new and old faces who are joining. So, I'll start with the first part. So it sounds like a lot of the group has worked on naming rights before and some haven't. Throughout my career, as Jesse kind of alluded to, I started on the brand consulting side, then moved over to the sales side and kind of in the consulting valuation role. So worked a lot behind the scenes on supporting the sales team to get those deals done, kind of going to that last poll question there, and how do you close the deal. But my background really has been consulting, valuation, and now on the sales side, so I can come from it from a lot of different perspectives. But overall, naming rights is a unique, it's a generational opportunity, and it's a moment in time that only happens so often, right? So you really have to be able to understand what's coming up, right? What's the trajectory of the team or the club or the venue? Where are we going in the long form, right? In terms of media, sponsorship, what's our clutter? Is our naming rights partner going to be, the one of one, right? Or are we going to have small naming rights and presenting sponsorships and a lot of different pieces? So, I think one of the things that I will stress throughout this conversation here today is really, the inventory bubble is higher than it's ever been, right? There's naming rights, there's patches, there's helmet decals, there are unique positions that are created in kind of the tier 2 sports that could be owning a goalpost or owning pitch clocks or branding that are kind of ubiquitous. So there are so many different assets out there right now. I think naming rights has historically always been one of one. A lot of times stadiums were out in the suburbs, and that was kind of that destination that was really that. But when you introduce all this inventory in districts and entertainment venues, the world of naming rights has really changed. And there are so many different other media offerings, which as a media buyer for some time and understanding that background, there's a lot of value in paid media. Naming rights can sometimes feel like a little bit of a leap of faith. But in terms of naming rights, I do believe that it is the most, it has the highest magnitude and stature for partners. And it truly is typically your most important partner that is going across, primary tenant, secondary tenant, third party events, and really being ubiquitous across all the events that take place in that market, and really being seen as kind of the hub and spoke of that destination from an entertainment and sports perspective.
That's awesome. Before I start asking you some questions, Seth, I will say to the group that's on here, we do have the Q&A portion here of the webinar. So feel free to ask questions as we go through this. We are going to leave some time at the end to answer some of those, but some of them might be relevant. I can see those questions pop up. So as they pop up, I'll read them out and we'll tackle your questions that you guys have on naming rights. But you kind of touched on this a little bit, Seth, but do you want to kind of just outline, there's been a lot of changes over the last several decades on naming rights, like where naming rights, when we thought of naming rights, it was just a stadium, right? Like a stadium naming right or something like that. What's kind of been the evolution of naming rights over the years to where we're at?
I think it's a great question, Jason. And I kind of touched on it a little bit, right? It was like the old, stadium model, right? And I can speak to a lot of different leagues and entities. The NFL has kind of been a little bit protected, NBA as well. But, when you're looking at some of the smaller leagues like MLS and again, part of the Big Four, they built destinations out in the suburbs, right? Now, fast forward, 20 years later, you're seeing all the MLS stadiums coming into the core downtown district for the supporters groups, the walking, to the stadium, that economic impact that naming rights can also create. So the world has changed in that manner a lot. I think you also have a lot of more smaller, intimate venues that have historically had, a legacy name or a philanthropic name on it that are looking for more revenue, right? I mean, at the end of the day, naming rights brings in revenue, and that's what everyone is looking for, especially as the world gets more fragmented in where you can spend your discretionary dollars. So it's super important to think about where naming rights are going. Today, right, just a couple examples that I'll provide is that, naming rights are the stadium, right? That is really what it is. But the districts, those entertainment centers that are being built around it, have become a hub and spoke of sports and entertainment as a whole and a larger destination than just game day, right? As the Taylor Swift concert comes there. if a small Savannah Bananas game comes there, right? That entertainment district is still bustling, right? And so I think it's critical for anyone who is either selling naming rights or buying naming rights to really understand what that economic impact can mean and what it can mean to that potential client or your existing client in terms of being, kind of ubiquitous and having that omnipresence. Now, I will say this tactfully, but one of the concerns about these new districts is, do you call it the Battery or do you call it Truist Field or Park, right? Like, do you use those names? Like, how does it become? I lived in Chicago for a very long time before moving out to Colorado, and most people call the United Center the UC, right? But they've built atriums and all these other things to help build in, third-party events and more, just foot traffic and pedestrian traffic throughout the day. So I think it's important to really understand who you are today, where you're going, right? What is this live, work, play destination going to look like over time? And really understanding, do you need to be the naming rights partner of the NFL, MLS, the big four, teams in that market? Or is there something a little bit more community centric that ties into your brand and really represents your brand versus being, the big dog in the market, right? There's a lot of naming rights that exist. There's more opportunities now than ever for naming rights. And so I think that, again, going back to what I said before, the inventory is so high right now that there's so many different places that you can, spend your discretionary dollars. So I think it's really important to understand KPIs, demographics, who you want to engage with, and what the long-term vision of, this naming rights can yield for the organization.
Well, it goes safe to say that, naming rights isn't just the sign on whatever it is, or like the naming right of that. There's so many other assets that are bundled in as part of a naming rights deal, right? Having the media piece to it, having some actionable marketing assets to it, like just building out a naming rights package is more customizable than it is just here's the name on the stadium, right? Like that's just one element of the overall naming rights. It's kind of like the crown jewel, right? And you get all the PR pieces to it and all the earned media and all that are with it, but there are a lot of elements to it. So one thing I wanted to ask you, Seth, was on the different types of naming rights opportunities, just to give people on here like some thoughts so they can be thinking about, whether it's in sports or outside of sports too, like what are some examples of those, and maybe even for smaller organizations too, like what are some types of naming rights that organizations should be looking at that way?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Jason. I'll take a couple of different tactics on that. So number one is that, naming rights, as I said before, it's generational value, right? Like there's a lot of brand, value, the PR, the press release, all that comes with like that initial kind of moment in time to really capture that value. But you can't just put your name on it, and if you build it, they will come, right? Like you have to activate it, you have to do that. And so again, depending on the brand or with the property, it's really impactful to be able to understand what you can do, right? And if you're a technology brand versus a C-store or a gas station, like how do you want your brand to be perceived and deployed within this venue, right? To have that ownership and all those different pieces. But I would tell you that, Jason, through my experience, one of the things that I've seen is that naming rights can come in a lot of different ways, shapes, and forms, right? For example, I had the privilege of working with the Rose Bowl. The Rose Bowl is obviously one of the most pristine, clean venues in terms of sponsorship. They had a donor who wanted to come in, and we were able to create kind of a philanthropic donation around naming rights to create Todd Speaker Field. Very untraditional. Does not get a lot of play in the media, does not get that, but it was because his, alma mater, UCLA, participates at the Rose Bowl. And so we were able to create a position that never existed before with zero inventory by utilizing the hedges that are iconic to the Rose Bowl and creating branding around that. I think subsequently to that, landmarks and entitlements have become the new thing, right? It's a destination. We work with a venue called Cocoa-Booth Amphitheater that's in North Carolina. It's a small 7,000 person amphitheater. And we've created these two destinations within the venue called the Lowe's Foods Front Porch, which is really the high-end kind of VIP deck, if you will, that has white glove service and waiters and all that kind of stuff. And then we've also created the Kona Wave Club, which is another entitlement within that used to be kind of an area that was utilized for basically ADA and other services. They've changed that out. They've improved those services. So we're able to take that surface area and change them into other things. I think the other trend that I'll just kind of touch on quickly is, these new games, right? Whether it's a Maui Gem Invitational or these new, Notre Dame versus this, team in this market, right? Those are presenting sponsorships, and it almost is treated like a bowl game, right? In terms of, hey, we kind of own this 1 week, and it's almost a pseudo naming rights of that big event that's coming and taking place. And a lot of times they take place in bigger DMAs and neutral locations. So it's an opportunity to extend partners into other events, into other places, versus just living in their home market or within that larger kind of radius in which a lot of times you see naming rights get done, which, I think it's changing a little bit now, but the old kind of rule of thumb was that, 90% of naming rights gets done within a 90-mile radius, meaning that that company's headquartered there, has presence. And I think that a little bit addresses the poll question earlier when individuals here asked about who to target, right? A lot of times it is coming from your backyard. A lot of times it is probably a current partner, and it is the usual suspects, but sometimes it's not. And so you have to dig deep, because naming rights is such a big ticket item that it's not something that any CMO just wakes up on and says, you know what, I want to spend 10 or $20 million tomorrow on a naming rights opportunity. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think you're spot on with that. As far as knowing who to target, usually the best naming rights partner are the ones who have, like, wherever their home base is, that they want to have a community element to it, right? They want to be like, hey, our organization is built here, right? And we want to be kind of known as that. And if they have an international presence and you have an international venue there, that's a bonus for them, right? Because they can still get all that exposure across the world, but yet their headquarters are in, Denver, for example, right? We're nearby where you're at. So, those types of things. And that's where you see, I mean, like, let's just use Ball, for example, in Colorado, right? They're based there, right? And so, but they have all these teams playing in Ball Arena there, and they've got all that exposure and all that media that they get around it, but they want to have a community play. Like, this is where we employ people. This is where we're part of the community. We are part of Denver, for example, right? And so those are usually the ones that are the best naming right partners, that have a either national or international kind of product or service offering. And they're in your backyard. That's typically Now, if you're more of a small community play, or like your amphitheater, that way, it's looking for maybe someone who's a local sponsor in that area that has a community play as well too. Like, we are serving the community. People have heard me say this before. I come from a credit union background on that. Like, credit unions are very, very community based, right? They want to like help the membership and help the member base there. And so, credit unions or banks or community banks, are good partners, that way with naming rights. So those are the best ones to really go after. So no, that's great. I'll have you touch on Seth, as far as brands. We may have some brand individuals on here, and I think it's good for those that are selling brands to understand how brands think as well too. But why would a brand outside of the community element of this and being in the backyard, like, why would a brand do or not do a naming right too? There's both elements there, right? Like, of doing it or not doing it. Like, what is kind of the yin and the yang of that?
So I think that, listen, if you are a brand that has the opportunity to potentially have the funding to do a naming rights deal, and I'm talking at the highest level of the big four, there's usually an alignment with the team, right? There's an alignment in terms of morality, ethics, the way that we show up together in the community, our shared purpose. All of those different things are really important, right? And that's a lot of what you kind of touched on, Jason. But I think what goes deeper into that is, brands changing perspective, right? Or perception of who they are, right? Putting your name on the building creates credibility, authenticity, alignment, used by the pros if you're a brand that is being, deployed or being utilized by the team themselves. So I think that there's a huge opportunity there. I think there's also been a lot of changes over the last several years that have yielded more opportunities for brands who have not done naming rights historically, or who don't even need naming rights, to go and do them. And I'll use one example, which, is going to be Climate Pledge Arena. Amazon doesn't really need naming rights from a brand awareness perspective, but the connection to the community, the employee morale, all of those things, yielded them to be, become the partner and really being able to showcase their technology. I think though, Jason, one of my old mentors had shared with me, like, if this does not go across every vertical of your business, if you don't have HR, you don't have, every person in this company saying, yes, this is going to be impactful for us. This is going to help, recruitment, retainment, employee morale, private banking, whatever the sectors might be, then it's probably not for you, right? There's other positions to be able to do that. So, but I see naming rights again being that big splash, right? With all the new developments of new stadiums and new technology, a lot of times, there's an opportunity for business. There's an opportunity to showcase the new brand, and really kind of, have that kind of omnipresence for that destination across concerts, music, sports, et cetera. So it's kind of a little bit for everyone. If you're just aligning with the team from a patch perspective or a helmet or something like that, then you're really only aligning with that team's IP. You're actually getting the entire community. A lot of times, when you look at a naming rights, every individual at one point in their life has stepped foot into that arena or venue at some point. So it means something different to everybody. And I think that allows a brand to go out and really capture a wide, net in terms of what this venue means to you, whether that's a graduation, a religious event, something else. But a lot of people have that experience of going to, that venue, that local venue. And it's one that, they really keep in their back pocket in terms of those memories and really memorable experiences.
And let me ask you this, kind of to piggyback with that. What are some of like the most important KPIs to look at when you're looking at whether you're on the brand side or on the property side, like looking at rights holder side of saying like, hey, this is how this has helped you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's those questions of like, why are you doing this? How are you going to judge the success of this partnership? That's always the great question to ask, is make sure you know like all the reasons why they're doing it so that you can show why they're doing it that way. But what are some like key like KPIs, or like how can you show the impact of a naming right deal?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the common denominator used to be impressions, and it just cannot, it's no longer impressions, right? You can go out and buy impressions for cheaper now. So I think you have to be able to create a product showcase, right? A destination for your clients, customers, hospitality, not hospitality meaning tickets or a suite, but money can't buy experiences. Can you sign up? I'm a Packers fan, so I'll use the Packers, who don't have a naming rights as my illustration here today. But can you be the Packers for the day, right? Can you sign up? You take a client through, you show them the locker room, you show them the history of the Green Bay Packers, and then you go and take them out to a dinner and you close the dinner in the locker room, right? So being able to create these memorable experiences and being able to utilize them in a way that is going to be able to say, hey, look, we spent X, we closed this much business from it. We also had, this much from a marketing value, from an ROI perspective. So it cannot be a one, size fits all model, right? Every naming rights partner and their category, their designations is really important. But there's also, times, Jason and Jesse, where like individual brands are feeling pressure with other brands coming into the market, and they feel like this is a defensive strategy to block them out and really plant their flag in that local market and be seen as that leader to kind of take, the team or the venue from point A to point C, because again, a lot of growth, a lot of renovations, a lot of development. So a lot of times the brand can serve as a hero. But I think one of the challenges that we have seen, Jason, as you asked about the challenges, is that a lot of times these older stadiums, or their leases are running out, right? So you see these short-term deals come in for 5 or 7 years towards the end of the lease. A great example of that is the Buffalo Bills, right? They had, New Era for a short period of time. Then Highmark came in. Now they got their new lease, their new stadium, and Highmark's rolling into that. So, there are these moments and times where brands step up, and sometimes it performs really well. But I think it's all about, really creating protections and safety nets for both the brand and the property. And again, the last one I'll just touch on from a negative perspective is, the risk around crypto, right? I mean, FTX is no longer a company. That has been obviously, a very big challenge in terms of, those that market in Miami. But then you still have crypto.com out in LA, right? So like things change. I think, from a sales perspective, my thing would be, you need credible, meaningful companies that are not just going to be .coms and have a 3 to 5 year boom. You really need a long-term partner that's going to have that shared vision and those same morals to take you into the next generation.
And you got to do your due diligence, on those. And sometimes things happen, but at the same time, those are higher risk naming right deals when you have an industry that comes in that's a little bit, newer. Those are usually a high risk naming right deals, that way, because especially if you do it, and we'll kind of transition into like structuring a naming right, deal on this. But like if you get into like super long ones and they're like only been in the industry for a couple of years, right? That's a high risk deal to see if they're going to be able to stick around and have some longevity there. So it is important to make sure that you're comfortable with whatever risk that's there, with it. If they pay you all 10 years up front, then that lowers the risk, right? So
if there's any brand people that are willing to pay 10 years up front, please let me know. I would like to know which brand is willing to do that.
That's probably the least risk. That's probably the least risky you could of naming right deal is doing that. No, that's awesome. Well, again, I know Jesse just mentioned this in the chat. We're going to go into structuring, how to structure a naming rights deal. I'm going to have Seth kind of outline, how he's typically structured naming right deals, what to really kind of look for with that. But and then we'll go into questions. If there's no questions, we'll end up we'll let you guys have the rest of your day here. But feel free to I have the Q&A open here. So if you got a question, I can ask Seth, or we can answer together. We're happy to do that. But Seth, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, structuring naming right deals, like what are the best way to structure it? Are there certain key assets? Are there terms that we should, like how long should it be? Like how do you value those assets as well? Like how much should you be charging? Like those types of things. I know I asked 3 different questions that could take a while, but kind of take some of those of like the annual fee for the sponsorship naming right fee, maybe the assets, and also just the term of it.
Yeah, I'll start with the term because that one seems to be the easiest. If you are entering a new venue that has never been named before, it needs to be 20 years or longer, right? Because your first deal is where you get all the sweat equity. It tends to be your highest deal, right? Because once you change the name, and if the venue hasn't changed in 15 or 20 years, there's a diminishing return pretty much out of the gate, right? So my thought is, if you're entering a new naming rights partnership, you're going to be your first partner. That is going to be probably your most meaningful partnership and probably your longest. And you hope that 20-year term turns out to 40 or 60 years, and they're always there. I saw Chris Lee is on the call here today, and so I saw that we worked on Mercedes-Benz Stadium a long time ago.
Chris Lee's my guy. I love Chris Lee.
Same here. Chris and I worked together twice, both on the LA Chargers, moving them from San Diego to LA, and then again he moved over to Arthur Blank Sports and Entertainment. But when we built Mercedes-Benz Stadium and our team was looking at that from a valuation perspective, we knew we needed a long-term deal because of all the venues all the events that would be coming through there. Jewel events, Super Bowl, all those different things. We had always talked about that, right? And so that's like how you build a big term, is knowing that all these future events, you have an NFL team, you have an MLS team, which I'll candidly say on this call, we probably undervalued at the time, not knowing that Atlanta United would be as successful as they are from an attendance perspective and just the magnitude that the market took. But the Falcons were going to the Super Bowl that year. Obviously, they lost, unfortunately, to the Patriots. But those are things that are moments in time that change the deal and get hype and really, again, open a new venue and really create that long-term trajectory. In terms of valuation, right? Valuation, I think, is very much subjective. I've worked my entire career pretty much on the valuation side. And so I believe it's a lot of the head and the heart. It's not necessarily just a formula, but it's a feeling. It's an emotional feeling. It's the way in which you want to see your brand perceived. And so I believe valuation turns out to be more of a range, right? You know what the previous partner paid, right? That's pretty clear to be able to understand that. And then you can kind of start to figure out, hey, if I replace their assets or if I build new assets, like this is the range in which it should fall in. So valuation from naming rights, I think, has been fairly easy just because there's so many comps out there and there's so many different data points. Where I think it's a bit more challenging, Jason, is with these pseudo naming rights, right? And I'll use example, as Madison Square Garden. They don't have a naming rights. Chase is kind of their pseudo naming rights, right? But what is Chase paying? Well, Chase is paying a lot different as a founding partner for that, position than a founding partner at, maybe FC Cincinnati, right? Because they have TQL Stadium, they have their naming rights partners. So a lot of times it really goes back down to the assets that you bundle, the stature, the designation, and the exclusivity. Because right now in our world, technology or AI or banking, right? It could be fintech. I mean, there's just so many different categories. And so it really comes down to how you want to envelope all that and what you're willing to pay for those exclusivities and for those designations. And that's both at the naming rights level, but also at the official partnership level too.
Love that. Well, we got a question in here. Bill, hey Bill, how you doing? Good to see you on here. Bill Macris, can you please share the most unique naming rights deal in each of the majors and also MLS, and what makes them unique? Like, we won't like put you on the spot to like really outline it, every single, but if you can maybe are there any unique ones that you feel are
well,
out there?
Bill, I don't know if I hit a chord with you before because I said I'm a Packers fan, but Soldier Field and Lambeau to me are going to be two in the NFL that I think, you have to pay attention to. What's happening with the Bears in terms of their transformation right now and moving, to a new location or improving what has historically been the Park District venue. Like those two things to me mean, hey, the Bears are ready to step up and drive revenue against a bit major asset. They're going to be investing in the club. So, I look at those types of, teams and say, wow, like to catch up to the, to the Cowboys and the Joneses, right? You got to understand that naming rights is your big ticket item. On the NBA side, I think Smoothie King is very interesting. I just feel like Smoothie King for me is not a brand that I would have thought had the size and magnitude to really do a naming rights deal. I was watching the play-in game last night and looking at their underbelly signage, and I kept thinking that to myself. So it's probably a little bit top of mind, but that is the one that I would call out from that perspective.
Yeah, go for it.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say the ones that came to mind for me were Climate Pledge.
Yep.
Up in Seattle. It's so unique, right? Like Amazon, is basically the naming rights of, but they didn't even use Amazon, right? It's like they wanted to show.
That goes back to community, right? It's community, and it's about changing the world. And Amazon doesn't need. I don't need more packages in my house. I can promise.
Exactly. Like, but that's the uniqueness. They're based there, right? And they decided to make it about like saving energy and recycling. Like the arena like collects water and like helps reuse that, like all these reusable energy is part of that. I thought that was a unique one. The other unique one that's starting to gain a little bit more, where you have a nonprofit organization as a naming right. Element here in Utah, we're based here in Utah. The Utah Jazz, before Ryan Smith became the owner, he's the founder of Qualtrics, and they put the Five for the Fight, the cancer charitable organization on the jerseys, right? Instead of putting Qualtrics on there.
I thought you were going somewhere different. I was going to say, for the first time ever, I've seen a naming rights partner return to the same market years later, because that's very, very uncommon.
Yeah, Delta Center, right? From back in the 90s, you get the Delta Center, and then all of a sudden Delta Center came back this week. Yeah, so that's another, but that is a unique situation there. So thanks for that question, Bill. Chris, our guy Chris, is asking, outside of building naming rights, do you have any interesting deal assets you have developed or encountered that have been included in naming rights or clubs areas?
No, that's a great question, Chris. One of the things that we have tried to do and really promote, and again, Chris, you might have touched a little bit of this at one point, but it's just about like creating these B2B platforms, right? Creating this shared, opportunity for our banking partner to lead a B2B summit with all of our partners, or being able to go on and really create opportunities. I think there's always this perspective that, the naming rights partner gets business from the team and other, parties do as well. But how can you create kind of, the authority, if you will, of like the technology team, the business team, and how can you all cross-pollinate, right? And I think that to keep sponsors, if you hit the impressions, great. But if you're driving business through the ecosystem and the surrounding ecosystem, because so many of these owners now own other businesses, it's not just, hey, I only own one franchise. But how can you take that partner and show them how you can take them through the entire journey of this ownership group, right? And we're working with a smaller league right now, which is considered, tier 2, the American Association of Professional Baseball. We are currently in a very, very unique position because unlike a lot of times where an owner is building a stadium by themselves using private money, we've actually taken the reverse of what used to be, taking municipal dollars and local dollars, and we're building it ourselves, right? So we have no RFPs, we have no RFQs. So we're talking about how we can create this business model and guarantee dollars via sponsorship to have them, deployed ubiquitously across the entire district, across the stadium, across the live, work, play, the apartments, the complexes, the hotels, all of that, to create connected rooms, to create things. So I think that's probably where we're going in terms of, how to extend assets. I believe too that, the money can't buy experiences have changed a little bit. But I do believe that, being able to be one-on-one with partners is super critical. And the last thing I'll mention too is that, yes, you name these areas, you name the Lowe's Foods front porch or the Lexus Club or what have you, but I think people don't see that as much as they used to see it because the inventory is so there. There's so many second screens. So I would actually tell you, like, leaning into gamification and utilizing, your phone a little bit more in terms of that fan engagement and experience, I think is actually going to have a lot more merit for partners than it used to, and something that you don't necessarily think about including in a naming rights deal, as opposed to just more of an official partnership.
Awesome. Love that. Nothing to add on my part. So I'm going to go to Kim on this. Kim Murphy, she asks, so what type of bundled marketing assets would you offer for naming rights without giving away all the inventory that you can sell otherwise? Right.
Yeah. Which is a great question.
Yeah. You don't want to just give it all up and to the
you can't give them the kitchen sink, right? You can't give them the kitchen sink. I think it's really about, who the brand is, right? And if they say, hey, we are targeting an affluent audience, right? Then you really say, hey, these are the spaces within the venue where we have our VIPs, right? And you really try to kind of part and parcel those pieces out, while retaining some of the key inventory to be able to sell in other places. Naming rights is typically, hey, if I get the exterior of the sign, I get the interior concourse, and I'm on the ice or I'm on the court, then I get what I need, right? I think you got to work a little harder for that. And I think that sometimes, where naming rights is, falls short is the resources and the activation that go into it. So, Kim, I would actually tell you, to get your number higher, right, and really build in a meaningful deal, I would actually build in higher activation funds so that you can use dollar for dollar uses, so that if the brand says, hey, we're just out of time, we can't do the t-shirt toss, we can't do this, we can't host people, we didn't know you were going to make the postseason, and we can't afford our suite. That's what you don't want from your naming rights partner, right? So I think it's a balance of assets and flexibility to making sure that over that term, you're not giving away the kitchen sink, but also knowing that as new assets get presented, then you could go to your naming rights partner and say, hey, before we take this to the market, the league just approved a new XYZ, right? Would you guys be interested in this? And so there's always kind of that evolving process, because, if you never bring it to your naming rights partner and it just goes elsewhere, then, they feel slighted a little bit too. So I think you have to start with kind of the core pieces, right? The exterior signage, the interior signage, the promotions, the activation, the hospitality, the money can't buy experiences. And then from there, I think, you kind of tailor it to based on what you have available. And a lot of times, again, it's based on what you've already sold, right? The biggest thing about sponsorship is keeping your renewal rate high and keeping your partners happy. And if you can over deliver and under promise, it's going to be a lot better than the other way around.
And what Nick Lane asked, what do you believe to be the multi-generational waterfall effect of naming rights within a community?
Great question, Nick. Love that question, because for me, I lived in Chicago, like I said, for a long time, and we had the opportunity to work on what was formerly the John Hancock Center. Everyone calls it the John Hancock Center. The Sears Tower, still the Sears Tower, right? So when you have those long-term 10, 20, 30-year naming rights that persist, then it gets adopted, right? Kids are taking field trips to that, venue. They're going to the observation deck. They're going on the cool elevator, and it's a memorable experience. No different than, the older generation and my contemporaries might call what is now Guaranteed Rate Field on the south side of Chicago Comiskey or something else, right? So I do believe that if you do these PR stunts for 3 to 5 years, it doesn't create the generational value. If you had that 10 to 15 year kind of watershed moment, those, naming conventions and that sweat equity is truly born, and really, derive that you can actually, build off of it.
Yeah, so longer term deals really help with that multi-generational, effect on that. Especially as mom and dad are taking their kids to that venue or that facility, and then it just becomes part of, hey, we're going to the Delta Center, right? And it just becomes ingrained. Allie Martin, good friend of mine, also on here. She didn't have a question, but she just wanted to share. She loves the backstory of, hopefully I get it right here, Allie, the Amalie Arena naming rights in Tampa. Did I say that right? Is it Amalie?
Emily, I believe.
Emily, okay. They are not a consumer brand, and most of their clients are in Europe. They sell into industrial lubricants. They chose to be the naming rights partner because they are family owned, operated in Tampa for over 100 years. They like what Jeff Vinnick was doing in the community and wanted to be part of support those efforts. So yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Like, they're based there, they're there, they like what they're doing in the community. And you mentioned this too, Seth, like what their alignment in values and the Vinnick's values and kind of come together and do that. So thanks, Allie, for sharing that. And then our last question here, Kevin Duplaga, he asks, in your experience, what important needs are key to address for car dealership potential naming right partners?
Car dealerships are a challenge. My dad actually owned auto auctions, so I can speak from a personal perspective on this here a little bit. But the challenge is, as long as you're working with the major auto groups, right? By way of example, Sam Swope Auto, right, which has every brand and everything under it, right? As long as you're getting the value of the category that you could go and extrapolate with one manufacturer plus maybe an auto aftermarket plus potentially a local dealer or another dealer group, like as long as the pie makes sense, I don't necessarily have a problem with going to car dealerships. That being said, from my experience, the CarMaxes of the world, the Auto Traders, the et ceteras, that are all coming out, that's a new category and a new trend, right? And that's a little bit different. And so, as the world changes with car dealerships, I would be more hesitant to say a 1 to 2 year partnership is probably where I would land on that. I don't know if I would feel comfortable and confident with a car dealership at a very local level becoming my naming rights partner. Because a lot of times they're like, hey, we want car displays, we want luxury, we want every different tier, right? And the number that you get just does not represent the pie that I had, kind of alluded to before. So I would tell you, I'd be sensitive to that category. Car rentals are going, kind of bonkers right now. There's a lot of competition around that. You're getting Turo and these other ones that are kind of coming out as like the Ubers of the world. So I think the auto industry is one that, again, is going to have meteoric trajectory across, sponsorship for a long period of time. However, I do believe, working with a Kia in a region, right, is a little safer than working with a local or more regional auto dealership, especially, if you don't have, the public information and ability of doing as much due diligence as you might need for some of those safety nets.
Yeah, it's definitely better to try and get the Kia or the Toyota or those as your sponsor rather than the dealership. But I have seen them, there and they can work. But to all Seth's points, you just have to be really careful on how you actually activate on that deal. But awesome. Well, those are our questions, and we've gotten through all the content here. Thank you everybody for joining this webinar on naming rights, and thank you, Seth, for joining us and sharing your insights and being the thought leader here for us. And we're just grateful for you to come on and share some insights. You can connect with Seth on LinkedIn. Also check out SRS Partners. His agency is doing some amazing things. He's even shared some of the things that he's been doing in valuation, and Seth has negotiated a lot of naming rights under his agency as well too. So if you're needing some help that way, he's there to help you as well too. But on behalf of Sponsor CX, thank you guys, and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks, Seth. See you guys.
Thanks.